Everything you knew about Napoleon is 100% wrong. Let's take a time machine back to the early 19th century and unearth the mythology surrounding one of history's most iconic figures, Napoleon Bonaparte. Often vilified and dramatized, Napoleon's story has been co-opted by psychologists, Hollywood, and even playground banter alike. We're tearing down this myth, brick by misleading brick. But first, what's the biggest misconception about him? Napoleon was short. Wait, was he really? Spoiler alert. Nope. Let's start with a little historical context. Napoleon Bonaparte was born on August 15, 1769 in Corsica, an island that had just been sold to France. His rise to power, from a military general to the Emperor of France, is the stuff of legends. But with great power comes great scrutiny, and sometimes a fair share of misinformation. The myth of Napoleon's height has been handed down through generations, so much so that it created the term Napoleon complex, describing short people who supposedly overcompensate for their stature by being overly aggressive. But, contrary to popular belief, Napoleon was not particularly short. In fact, he was of average height for his time. Historical records indicate that Napoleon stood around 5 feet 6 inches tall. However, here's where it gets complicated. During Napoleon's era, the French measured height using the pied de roi, or the king's foot, which is a little longer than the British foot. So when English sources documented his height, mistranslations and misunderstandings ensued, painting him as shorter than he actually was. Now let's get to the origin of the Napoleon complex. This term didn't come into popular use until the 20th century. British propagandists and satirical artists often portrayed Napoleon as a tiny, irate man to undermine his authoritarian image. Over time, this caricature took on a life of its own. Imagine this. You're a British artist in the 1800s. How do you depict a man who's invaded most of Europe and crowned himself emperor? By making him look small and ridiculous. British cartoons from that era often depict Napoleon as unusually short, standing next to taller soldiers or horses to emphasize the disparity. But why do we still believe this? Part of it lies in confirmation bias. We tend to believe what we've always heard and accept it as fact. The other part, quite honestly, is that the idea of a short, angry man rampaging across Europe is far more entertaining to our imaginations than the truth. It's crucial, however, to distinguish between myth and reality, because myths can often overshadow the actual, historical achievements of individuals. Let's not forget that Napoleon significantly impacted legal systems around the world with his Napoleonic Code, reshaped European politics, and revolutionized military strategy. Gazing deeper into history, you'll find other figures also burdened by myths and misconceptions. Take, for example, the story of the Trojan horse. For centuries, the idea of Greek soldiers hiding inside a gigantic wooden horse to infiltrate Troy has fascinated us. However, recent archaeological evidence suggests it might have been a metaphor for an earthquake that weakened Troy's defenses, making the city vulnerable to attack. Now, back to Napoleon. One of his greatest legacies is undoubtedly the Napoleonic Code. This set of civil laws laid the foundation for modern legal systems in many countries, emphasizing clearly written and accessible laws. Under the Napoleonic Code, all male citizens were granted equal rights, and it served to abolish feudalism. So while the myth of his height might dwarf him, his contributions certainly do not. Moving on, let's talk about the Battle of Waterloo. Often dubbed his ultimate defeat, it's key to note that even there, Napoleon demonstrated remarkable strategic prowess despite being outnumbered. His defeat can be attributed to a series of unfortunate events and tactical errors, rather than any psychological shortcomings hypothetically tied to his short stature. The reason for Napoleon's downfall at Waterloo was not solely a result of his own mistakes, but also due to the reassembled coalition of European powers. They learned from their past defeats and managed to outmaneuver Napoleon through sheer number and strategy. The battle itself was a close call, turning into a fierce and chaotic struggle that lasted an entire day. Nevertheless, the historical significance of the battle has often been reduced to emblematic vignettes rather than detailed examinations. After his defeat, Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he spent his remaining days. He died in 1821, but not before dictating memoirs that to this day provide historians with valuable insights into his mind and experiences. Despite the circumstances, he remained intellectually active until his last breath. What remains powerful about Napoleon's story is its complexity. He was a man of paradoxes, a champion of revolutionary ideals who declared himself emperor, a military genius who made grave strategic errors. This complexity is critical to understanding why myths, like his so-called short stature, are so easily propagated. They simplify a multifaceted character into easily digestible narratives. That's why it's so important to critically examine historical narratives. When we reduce Napoleon to just the short guy with a complex, we miss out on the broader lessons his life story has to offer. He wasn't a caricature. He was a deeply influential figure whose actions and decisions reverberate to this day. So next time someone mentions the Napoleon complex, remember this: the real Napoleon was no shorter than the average man of his time. He wasn't compensating for anything except perhaps the need for a unified and progressive Europe. Myths can be fun, but the reality is often far more intriguing, complex, and instructive. To truly understand history, we need to dig deeper, challenging our preconceptions and seeking the factual truths buried beneath layers of fiction and hyperbole. Remember, history is written by the victors, and sometimes the cartoonists. Don't believe everything you've been told, question it, seek the truth. Because in the grand tapestry of history, it's the layers of nuanced complexity that make the story truly compelling. And the next time you see a cartoon of a tiny, angry Napoleon, have a good laugh. But know that the real story is far more fascinating.